Somewhere in the North Atlantic, 500 miles from land, a sailboat called Theros burned down to the waterline and sank, and the couple who had spent years rebuilding it with their own hands watched it happen from a 10-foot rubber dinghy. Their names were Brett and Sarah. And if you have ever sat somewhere you did not want to be and thought seriously about selling everything you own, buying a boat, and sailing away with the person you love, then this is the story of two people who actually did it. He was a marine mechanic. He rebuilt that boat himself, over years, on a budget, wire by wire. They sailed her thousands of miles just to reach the starting line, and in June of 2024, they finally pointed the bow east toward Europe. 27 days later, they washed up together on a remote sandbar off Nova Scotia, still in the dinghy, no water, no supplies, no shelter. And one of them was still wearing a flotation suit that had been burned away down one entire side of the body. They never sent a single call for help, not one. Even though that boat was carrying an emergency beacon, a satellite tracker, and a fully stocked life raft, any one of which would have brought rescue running from hundreds of miles away. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened aboard Theros, why all three of those devices failed them in the same instant, and why the one modification this couple was proudest of is almost certainly what killed them both. Before I go any further, I want to be straight with you about one thing, because it matters. There is no footage of that fire. Nobody filmed it, and nobody saw it. Everything you are about to hear is built on the official investigation carried out afterwards by Canada's transportation safety authorities, on what was physically recovered from the sea and the shore, and on the videos this couple made themselves in the years before they left. Where the record is certain, I will tell you plainly. Where investigators had to reconstruct from evidence, I will tell you that too, and I will not dress a guess up as a fact. These two people deserve that much. Brett had been around boats his entire life. He sailed, he swam, he spent every hour he could in and around the water, and for a long stretch of his working life, he was employed on the railways, which is about as far from the ocean as a job can get. But the water never let go of him, and eventually he ended up on the west coast of Canada, working as a mechanic on ferry boats. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story, so hold on to it, because Brett was not a retiree who bought a yacht on a whim after reading a magazine. He fixed marine engines for a living. He crawled around in engine rooms. He understood machinery in the way that only somebody who has taken it apart and put it back together 1,000 times can understand it, and he had spent years keeping vessels running and getting other people safely back and forth across cold water. If you were going to bet on anybody pulling off an ambitious ocean crossing on a limited budget, you would have bet on a man exactly like him. But Brett wanted more than the coastline he already knew. He did not want to sail on weekends and come home to the same dock every Sunday evening and go back to work on Monday morning. He wanted to untie the lines for good and let the ocean take him wherever it happened to go, with no schedule and nobody expecting him anywhere, and that is a dream that lives quietly inside an enormous number of people. Most of us think about it in traffic, and then never do a single thing about it. Brett did something about it. And then, later in life, he met Sarah. The way they met is the kind of thing that sounds invented. Brett traveled to the United Kingdom to donate a kidney to his sister, and that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means he volunteered to go under a surgeon's knife and give away a functioning part of his own body, and accept every risk that comes with that, so that somebody he loved could go on living. That is who this man was before the story even properly begins. And while he was over there for that surgery, in a country he had no other reason to be in, he met the woman who would become his wife. She was some years younger than him. She was not a lifelong sailor the way he was, but she took to it, and she took to him, and by every account that survives them, she was every bit as committed to the plan as he was. They married, and together they decided that they were going to spend whatever years they had left doing the thing Brett had always dreamed about, which was sailing around the world, slowly, in their own boat, with no particular deadline. The boat they chose was called Theros, and she was not a gleaming million-dollar yacht. She was an older French-built sailboat, and they bought her the way most people actually get into this life, which is to say cheaply, and in need of an enormous amount of work. And I want to spend a moment on that, because I think people who have never done it genuinely do not understand what it means to buy a cheap old boat. When you see a 40-something-foot sailboat listed for the price of a used car, that price is not a bargain. That price is a warning. It means the boat has reached the point in its life where the accumulated cost of everything that is wrong with it has caught up with what it is worth, and the previous owner has decided to stop. The rigging is old. The sails are tired. The through-hull fittings, which are the holes deliberately cut in the bottom of your boat for water intake and drainage, are at the end of their service life, and every one of them is a potential hole in the hull. The wiring has been added to by 4 different owners over 30 years, none of whom labeled anything. The engine may or may not start, and if it starts, it may or may not keep going. Buying that boat is not the end of the process. It is the beginning of a project measured in years, and the only 2 currencies that project accepts are money and your own labor. If you have very little of the first, you must have an enormous amount of the second. Brett had an enormous amount of the second. He poured himself into that boat. He repaired her, he refitted her, he rewired her systems and rebuilt her fittings, and slowly, season by season, weekend by weekend, he turned a tired old sailboat into a home that was genuinely capable of crossing oceans. That is thousands of hours of work. It is 100 small victories nobody but you will ever notice, and it builds something in a person that goes well beyond the boat itself. By the time you have rebuilt a vessel with your own hands, you do not simply own it. You know it. You know every wire behind every panel, because you are the one who put it there. That knowledge is a wonderful thing. It is also, and I say this carefully, the beginning of a particular kind of danger, and we will come back to it. And they filmed all of it for a small YouTube channel, because that is what you do now when you are chasing something like this. They documented the work, the setbacks, the wins, the slow transformation of a neglected old hull into a home. If you go back and watch those videos today, knowing how it ends, they are genuinely hard to sit through, because you are watching 2 people build the thing that is going to kill them, and you can see in every single frame how happy they are while they do it. And I want to be very clear about something, because it changes how you hear everything that comes next. These were not reckless people. They were not fools with more optimism than sense. They were careful. They planned. They had real experience, and they were plainly, obviously in love. This was never supposed to be a tragedy. But there was one decision, one change they made to Theros that set her apart from essentially every other boat crossing an ocean that summer. Brett and Sarah wanted the voyage to be green. They looked at the way every cruising sailboat on Earth actually crosses an ocean, which is with a diesel engine humming away below deck for a significant portion of the trip, and they decided they wanted to do it cleanly, without leaving a trail of burnt fossil fuel behind them all the way around the world. And you can understand that completely. It comes from a good place. It is exactly the sort of idea 2 thoughtful people talked themselves into over a long winter, sitting in a boatyard, looking at an old diesel engine, and thinking there has to be a better way to do this. They were proud enough of the idea that they built the entire identity of their voyage around it. It was the thing that made their trip theirs. So Brett did something that almost nobody does. He pulled the diesel engine out of the boat entirely. Now I need you to understand what that actually means, because on a cruising sailboat, the engine is not a convenience. It is not there so you can go a bit faster when you get bored of sailing. It is the thing that gets you off a rocky shore when the wind dies and the swell is pushing you in. It is how you claw away from a hazard, how you punch through a flat calm to get somewhere safe before weather arrives, how you hold your position while somebody works on deck, how you charge your batteries, how you get into a harbor at night in a narrow channel, and how you get yourself out of 100 kinds of trouble that the sails alone simply cannot get you out of. Sailors argue about nearly everything. They argue about anchors and rigs and hull shapes and the correct way to coil a rope. But there is close to universal agreement on this one thing, that a reliable diesel engine is the single most important piece of safety equipment on a cruising boat after the hull itself. Brett took his out, and he replaced it with an electric motor. An electric motor needs electricity, and pushing a heavy displacement sailboat through open ocean needs a very great deal of it, far more than you would guess. So he needed a battery bank, a big one. And here is the choice that echoes all the way to the end of this story. He built that bank out of a battery pack salvaged from a wrecked Nissan Leaf. If you do not know much about batteries, that might honestly sound clever, resourceful even. Take a perfectly good pack out of a written-off electric car, mount it in the boat, charge it from solar panels on the deck, and save yourself both thousands of dollars and a great deal of carbon along the way. It is the kind of solution that appeals enormously to a man who fixes things for a living. Brett trusted his own hands. He had built every other system on that boat, and all of them worked. And here is the part that most people miss when they hear this story, and it is the part that makes it genuinely tragic rather than simply stupid. That system worked. For a long time, and over a very long distance. They did not build the electric drive and then immediately point the boat at the Atlantic. They sailed her thousands of miles first. Down the west coast of North America, which is a serious piece of water in its own right, with cold fog and shipping traffic and a coastline that does not forgive mistakes. Then south, and through the Panama Canal, which is an achievement most sailors never manage in their lives. Then up through the Caribbean, and north again along the eastern seaboard of the United States, all the way to Nova Scotia, purely and simply to reach the starting line for the Atlantic crossing. That is not a shakedown sail, that is a voyage. That is the sort of trip that people write books about and talk about for the rest of their lives, and the electric propulsion system did everything Brett asked of it for the entire distance. It got them out of harbors and into anchorages, and through calms, thousands of miles of it, without ever giving them a reason to doubt it. By the time they tied up in Halifax in the spring of 2024, that setup had proven itself over more ocean than most sailors will ever see. Which is exactly why neither of them had any reason on earth to believe it would be the thing that ended them. But here is what you need to know about that specific battery, and I am going to keep this simple, because you do not need an engineering degree to feel the weight of it. There are different kinds of lithium battery. That sounds like a technicality, and it is not. It is the difference between a bad day and a fatal one. The lithium batteries that are purpose-built for boats use a chemistry, and you will sometimes see it written as LFP, that is deliberately chosen because it is relatively stable. It holds less energy for its size, it is heavier for the same capacity, and marine engineers accept both of those disadvantages happily, because when that chemistry fails, it tends to fail slowly and sulkily, and without trying to kill everybody in the room. The batteries inside most electric cars use a different chemistry altogether. It packs an enormous amount of energy into a very small, very light space, because in a car, weight and space are everything. That is precisely what makes it brilliant in a car, and it is precisely what makes it terrifying on a boat. When one of those car packs fails, whether it has been physically damaged, or it overheats, or a fault develops deep inside a single cell, or salt water finds its way in where it should not be, it does not simply stop working, it catches fire, and it is not an ordinary fire. Here is what actually happens, in plain language. A battery pack is not one battery. It is hundreds of small cells packed tightly together, like books on a shelf. If one of those cells fails, it heats up violently, and because it is jammed against its neighbors, it cooks them. Then they fail too, and they cook their neighbors, and the whole thing walks itself through the pack in a chain reaction. Engineers call this thermal runaway, and the name is exact. Once it starts, it runs away from you. And the reason you cannot stop it is this. As those cells break down, the chemistry inside them releases oxygen. The fire is generating its own oxygen supply from the inside, out of its own materials. Everything you have ever been taught about fighting a fire is built on taking away its air. Smother it with a blanket, put a lid on the pan, hit it with a foam extinguisher, cut off the oxygen, and it dies. None of that works here. You cannot suffocate a fire that is manufacturing its own oxygen. Water will not stop it either, and salt water, which is the one substance there is a genuinely limitless supply of in the middle of an ocean, can make it dramatically worse, because salt water conducts electricity and will happily short out the healthy cells that have not failed yet. Fire crews on land are trained that once one of these packs goes into thermal runaway, you do not try to put it out. You get everybody clear, you protect what is around it, and you let it burn until there is nothing left in it to burn. That is the accepted procedure. On land, with a fire engine already parked outside, a hydrant on the corner, and a hospital 20 minutes away. Now imagine that same event with no fire engine, no hydrant, no hospital, nowhere to run to, no ground under your feet at all, and a fiberglass hull underneath you that will itself burn fast and hot once the flames get into it. And it is not as though nobody saw the danger. This is not hindsight invented after the fact. Experienced sailors, and people who work with these batteries professionally, had raised concerns about exactly this kind of setup for years. Salvaged car cells, taken out of a vehicle that was damaged badly enough to be written off, installed in a damp saltwater environment, subjected to constant vibration and pounding, powering an ocean crossing, watched over by a home-built management system. To anybody who understood the chemistry, that read like a countdown, but Brett had built that entire boat with his own two hands, and every system on it had worked, all the way from the west coast of Canada to Nova Scotia. And you can understand, can't you, how a competent man arrives at the point of trusting himself on one more thing. That is not arrogance. That is what competence feels like from the inside. So picture what was actually aboard Theros as she left Halifax that June, and understand that nobody involved intended a single moment of harm. A battery bank that, if it ever failed, would produce a fire that essentially cannot be extinguished, mounted inside a fiberglass hull, hundreds of miles from any help of any kind, surrounded on every side by the one substance that feeds those flames rather than stopping them. Every ingredient was already aboard that boat before they ever left the dock. All it ever needed was a trigger. So here is what is certain, and this part comes straight from the record. Theros left Halifax in the second week of June 2024, on a route across the North Atlantic to the Azores, and from there onward toward Europe. And I want to give you a sense of what that actually is, because for most people the words crossing the Atlantic do not carry much weight. It is roughly 2,000 miles of open water. At the speed a boat like Theros travels, that is a matter of weeks, not days. For most of that time, you are further from land than most human beings ever get in their lives, with 2 miles of cold black water underneath the floor you are standing on. There are no other boats. There is no Coast Guard nearby. If a container ship happens to pass in the night, it will not see you and it will not stop. You sail in shifts, one person on watch while the other sleeps, around the clock, for weeks. You get tired in a way that is difficult to describe, and you accept, before you leave, that if something goes seriously wrong out there, the nearest help is not minutes away or hours away, it is days away, and it is only coming at all if somebody knows you need it. But I want to be fair to Brett and Sarah here. That crossing is not madness. It is a well-traveled route that competent sailors complete every single year, in boats no better than theirs, and there was nothing insane about the plan itself. Thousands of people have done it. The great majority of them arrive. The whole way, they were sending position updates home through a satellite tracker, one of those small devices that pings your location up to a satellite every so often, so that family can follow along on a map from the kitchen table, thousands of miles away. Every ping was a small reassurance to the people watching at home. Still going, still fine, still out there. The last one came in on the afternoon of June 13th. An unremarkable position, on an unremarkable day, southeast of Sable Island. The weather was not the problem. There was no storm. And then nothing. No distress call, no emergency signal, no final message of any kind. One ordinary update, and then a silence that would stretch on for weeks, while nobody yet understood what it meant. And this is the detail that tells you the whole story, once you understand what it is actually telling you. Theros was carrying everything that is supposed to save your life in exactly this situation. Not one thing, 3 separate independent systems, each of which was capable of saving both of them on its own. The first was an APERB. That stands for Emergency Position, Indicating Radio Beacon, and it is the single most important piece of safety equipment on an ocean-going boat. It is about the size of a large thermos flask. When you activate one, it transmits on a dedicated distress frequency straight up to a network of satellites that exists for no other purpose than listening for exactly that signal. Within minutes, a rescue coordination center on land knows that a vessel is in distress and knows where it is to within a very small margin. That is not a maybe. That is a system that works, reliably, every day, all over the world, and it has saved thousands of lives. The second was the satellite tracker they had been using to send those position pings home. Those devices are not only trackers, they have an SOS function. One button, held down for a few seconds, and it sends an emergency alert with your exact coordinates to an international response center that is staffed 24 hours a day. And the third was a proper life raft. Not a toy, not an inflatable dinghy, but a purpose-built, enclosed, self-inflating raft with a canopy over the top, designed to keep human beings alive at sea for weeks. They contain drinking water, rations, flares, a sea anchor to stop you drifting too fast, and most importantly, shelter from sun, wind, and spray. People have survived astonishing lengths of time in those things. They are the difference between an accident and a funeral. Any one of those 3 would have saved them. Not one of them was ever used. The beacon never transmitted. Not a single burst. The tracker never sent an SOS, despite sitting there with a button on it that would have taken 2 seconds to press. And when Brett and Sarah were finally found, 27 days later, they were not in the life raft at all. They were in the dinghy, a 10-foot inflatable with no cover, no supplies, and no business whatsoever being in the open ocean, the kind of small boat you use to get from your anchored yacht to a beach and back. And that is where both of them were, with essentially nothing. So the entire case comes down to a single question. What goes so wrong and so fast that two careful and experienced people cannot reach any one of the three devices meant to save their lives, and instead end up throwing themselves into a beach boat with nothing but the clothes on their backs? The answer is written on that burned flotation suit. Here is the reconstruction that the evidence supports, and this is the point where hard certainty ends and the physical evidence begins to speak for two people who cannot speak for themselves. Somewhere out there, the battery failed. We cannot know the exact trigger, and we never will. It could have been a fault deep inside a single cell that had been quietly developing for months. It could have been a little salt water in the wrong place, which is not exotic on a boat, it is Tuesday. It could have been a connection that finally worked itself loose after thousands of miles of pounding and vibration. But whatever started it, what followed would have been almost incomprehensibly fast. This is not a fire that begins small in a corner and grows politely while you go and fetch an extinguisher and think about your options. A pack that size going into thermal runaway is closer to an eruption. Flame fills the space in seconds. The heat is ferocious and immediate, and the smoke is thick, black, and genuinely poisonous, full of chemicals that will drop a person who breathes them in. There is no firefighting phase in this scenario. There is only the getting out phase, and it is measured in seconds, not minutes. Now think about where that battery lived. Investigators determined that it was mounted low in the boat, right by the companionway. The companionway is the main stairway you climb down to get into the cabin, and on a boat like Theros, it is essentially the only way in or out of the interior. Everything below deck is reached through it, and the life raft was mounted directly above that same opening. Do you see the trap that had been built, entirely by accident, over the course of years of careful work? When the fire came up out of the hull, it came up through the exact path they needed. The companionway filled with flame and smoke, and in that instant the entire interior of the boat, and everything stored in it, was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Unreachable. The life raft, sitting immediately above the source of that fire, was almost certainly destroyed or made impossible to get to within the first few seconds. Either burned through, or simply surrounded by flame with nobody able to get near enough to release it. And the emergency beacon, stored down inside the cabin near the batteries themselves, was gone or unreachable just as fast. Every safety device they owned was on the wrong side of the fire. That is the answer to the question this whole story hangs on. It was not negligence, and it was not panic, and it was not incompetence. It was geometry. The fire started at the one point in the boat that cut them off from every single thing that could have saved them, and it did it in the space of a few breaths. One of them was wearing a flotation suit when the flames reached them. A flotation suit is a full-body immersion suit, thick and insulated, designed to keep you afloat and slow down hypothermia if you end up in cold water. And the burning down one side of that suit did not happen later, while they drifted. Investigators established that the damage occurred while the suit was being worn, which means it happened right there, in those first frantic seconds, as two people fought their way out of a boat that was becoming an inferno underneath them. That single finding is the piece of physical evidence that turns this from an unexplained disappearance into a story we can actually tell. Without it, Theros is just another boat that vanished. With it, we know there was a fire, we know roughly how fast it moved, and we know that at least one of them was close enough to it to be burned while wearing protective clothing. The only thing left that they could reach was the dinghy, stowed forward on the deck, ahead of the flames and away from the companionway. So they cut it loose, and they got themselves into it, and then they sat in a 10-foot rubber boat in the middle of the North Atlantic and watched their home, their project, years of their lives, and every single possession they had left in the world burn down to the waterline and go under. And if that were the end of it, it would already be a tragedy. But it is not the end, because they survived that part. And then the second ordeal began. They were alive, adrift in an open dinghy, with no cover, no fresh water, no food and no shelter, in the North Atlantic, where even in June the water is cold enough to pull the heat out of a human body faster than that body can replace it. At least one of them was badly burned, in an environment with no clean water to rinse a wound, no dressings, no pain relief, and no relief of any kind. They had no beacon, no radio, no flares, and no way to signal anything to anybody, and not one single person anywhere in the world yet knew that anything had gone wrong. Because here is the cruel mechanics of it, and this is the part I find hardest to sit with. With no emergency signal ever transmitted, there was no reason for anyone to come looking, From shore, Brett and Sarah were simply out of contact. And being out of contact on an ocean crossing is completely, utterly normal. Trackers fail, batteries die, devices get dropped over the side or soaked or forgotten. People go quiet for 4 days and then send a cheerful message about dolphins. It happens constantly, on every ocean, in every season. Search and rescue services on both sides of the Atlantic understand this better than anybody. Launching a full ocean search is not a small thing. It means long-range aircraft flying search patterns over thousands of square miles of empty water. It means diverting ships. It means crews putting themselves at genuine risk. And it costs an extraordinary amount of money every single hour. That machine cannot be started because a family has not heard from somebody in a while, because if it were, it would be running constantly and it would be useless when it was actually needed. So the system waits for a signal. That is not callousness. That is the only way it can possibly function. But it means that in this particular case, the entire apparatus that existed to save these two people never even began to turn, because the one thing that would have started it was sitting in a burning cabin 30 seconds after the fire began. Their family and friends did grow worried as the days went by and the tracker stayed silent. They made calls. They raised the alarm as best they could. Anybody who has ever waited for a message that does not come will understand something of what those weeks were like on shore. But the search that could have saved them did not begin when they needed it. It did not begin that day, or the next day, or the day after that. It began weeks later, once Theros was long overdue on the far side of the ocean, and there was simply no other explanation left to hope for. By then, of course, it had been a very long time. Try, if you can, to imagine those days in the dinghy, because I think that is where this story actually lives, and it is the part nobody wants to look at directly. The first hours would have been shock and adrenaline, and the smell of the fire still in their hair and clothes, and the disbelief of watching your entire life sink in front of you. Then the first night, and the cold coming up through the thin rubber floor, and the realization that nobody is coming yet because nobody knows. Then a sunrise, and an empty horizon in every direction, 360 degrees of nothing, and the beginning of real thirst. Thirst is what kills you out there, and it is worth understanding why, because it is not simply discomfort. A human being can survive a remarkably long time without food, weeks in fact, but without fresh water the body begins to shut down within days. You cannot drink seawater, because processing the salt costs your body more water than the seawater provides, so drinking it actively speeds the process up. Meanwhile, the sun is on you all day with no shade, and the wind and spray are stripping heat out of you all night, and if you are burned, your body is losing fluid through the wound as well, and fighting infection with nothing to fight it with. So you sit, you scan the horizon for a ship, and every hour it stays empty. You ration whatever you have, which in their case appears to have been essentially nothing, and you hold on to the person beside you. Two people who had given up everything they owned to chase a dream, holding on to each other in a small rubber boat, watching for a rescue that had not yet even been ordered. We do not know how long they lasted, and I am not going to invent a number to make the story tidier. Without fresh water, a person does not have very long, and the cold and the burns would each have taken their own toll on top of that. What we do know, and what I think matters, is that they stayed together, and that they were found together. And here is the last strange turn in it. The wind and the current did not carry that dinghy out into the empty middle of the Atlantic, the way you might expect. They carried it back toward land. Back, roughly, the way it had come, toward the shore of Sable Island, that same lonely sandbar they had sailed past on their very last ordinary afternoon. Sable Island is one of the strangest places on the eastern seaboard. It is a thin crescent of sand about 100 miles off the Nova Scotia coast, less than a mile wide at its widest point, with no trees, no harbor, and no safe approach. It is famous for two things. The first is a population of wild horses that has lived there for centuries. The second is the extraordinary number of ships it has swallowed. The sandbars around it shift constantly, the fog is thick for much of the year, and the island sits directly across one of the busiest shipping approaches in the North Atlantic. Estimates run to hundreds of wrecks. They call it the graveyard of the Atlantic, and it has earned the name several hundred times over. That is where the dinghy came ashore in July, and that is where Brett and Sarah were found, by people working out on the island. Together, in the small boat they never should have needed, on the shore of a place that has been collecting sailors for 400 years. There is one more detail from the investigation that I think matters, and it is a quiet one that is easy to skip past. The emergency beacon aboard Theros had never been registered. Registering an appearb is free. It takes about 5 minutes on a website. What it does is tie that specific beacon to your name, your vessel, its description, and your emergency contacts, so that the instant a signal arrives at a rescue center, the people there know exactly what they are looking for, how many souls are aboard, and who to telephone. An unregistered beacon still transmits, and rescuers will still come, but they arrive knowing nothing. They do not know if it is a 15-meter yacht with 2 people aboard or a fishing boat with 8. They do not know what the vessel looks like from the air, and they cannot ring a family member to ask where you were headed. It would not have saved them, and I want to be honest about that, because the beacon never transmitted at all. But it is a small, uncomfortable window into how easily a competent and careful person leaves one boring administrative job undone, tells themselves they will do it next week, and then never thinks about it again. It would be very easy, and I think far too easy, to reduce all of this to a list of mistakes. Plenty of people have done exactly that, and some of them have not been kind about it. The battery should never have been that chemistry. That is true. The beacon should have been registered and mounted outside in the cockpit where a hand could find it in 1 second on the way past. That is true. The life raft should never, under any circumstances, have been sighted directly above the single piece of equipment on the entire boat most likely to catch fire. That is also true, and of everything on the list, it is the one that hurts the most, because it was free to get right. It cost nothing but a decision about where to bolt a bracket. And if you take one practical thing away from this story, please let it be this, because it applies to your boat, and your house, and your car, and every other place you have ever put something important. The safety equipment that is supposed to save your life is worth absolutely nothing unless you can physically reach it in the 3 seconds you might actually have. Not stowed in the cabin, not in a locker under a bunk with 4 bags of sails on top of it, not directly above the thing most likely to burn, where your hands can find it, in the dark, in the wrong weather, while everything is going wrong at once and you cannot think straight. Go and look at where yours is. That is the whole lesson, and it costs nothing. But I do not want to leave you with a list of failures, because that is not really what this is. This is the story of a man who gave his own sister a kidney and then met the love of his life on the trip where he did it. A couple who, at exactly the age when most people quietly fold their dreams up and put them away in a drawer for good, decided instead to chase theirs all the way across an ocean. They built their boat with their own hands, over years, without much money. They sailed her thousands of miles, down one coast and through a canal and up another, just to get to the place where the real adventure started. They tried to do it cleanly and thoughtfully, in a way they genuinely believed was better for the world they were sailing through. And in the end, they died together, in a small boat, on a very large sea. They made mistakes. Every one of us does. Every single day. Most of us are simply fortunate enough to make ours somewhere that forgives them, in a place where a bad decision costs you money or time or embarrassment. Theirs were made in the one place on this earth that forgives nothing at all. So if you have ever dreamed of doing what Brett and Sarah did, and if you are still here with me after all this way, then some quiet part of you probably has, then honor them the way I think they would want to be honored, not by being frightened of the ocean, and not by never going. By respecting it, by checking the boring, unglamorous things twice, by taking the free 5 minutes and the cheap piece of equipment seriously, because those are the things that turn a catastrophe into a story you tell at the dock. And by making absolutely certain that the thing meant to save your life is a thing you can actually reach on the worst day of it. They found each other late, the two of them, and they spent their final chapter doing exactly what they loved, side by side, with the person they loved most in all the world. There are far worse ways to be remembered than that. Rest easy, sailors.